that you designed, and you didn't say that very modestly. And politically, you made it bottom 40, but it's nice. It's a practical measure. I think it's workable. Will you be able to collect that data? I mean, in India, is a question for all researchers because we don't have an annual NSS. So I'm a little annual, whatever. Yeah, NSS. Yeah. So we don't sample these things annually. So how is this going to work? I mean, forget sub-Saharan Africa. If just in India, how are you going to get a time series that we pick up over 10 years, which actually even captures the measure that you seek to capture? Thank you.
I really think I'd rather give up my 5 minutes just for to get questions from the audience. Yes. Yeah.
Actually, I could do the same. I mean, get reaction from the audience. And if I get a chance at some point, I will bring the PPP problem. I will bring it, but I'll bring it later. Yeah.
Kaushik, you're supposed to. You are going to share.
Okay, I'm very sorry. And I should tell you that my chairing it is a complete misunderstanding because Bruno, when he asked me, he said that, will you share the last session? I thought I always am in favor of sharing, so I said yes. And then I realized that I was going to chair the last session. Okay. So let's take questions. Yeah. Sorry? There are 2 rooms. Okay. So then, let's start with this room, and then you people tell me if people are getting agitated there. So. So Ajit, let's take a question. Yeah. Then Kalle, and we'll move around.
Hello, I'm Ajit Mishra. The question is addressed primarily to Kaushik Basu, but it's also related to the point which Debraj made. This is about shared prosperity as a target is fine, as everybody agrees in the panel. But what's the instrument for it? For poverty, we know, poverty reduction policies and so on and so forth. For inequality, again, you can talk about redistributive policy, although you may not implement. But, what kind of policy, as in that, you have in mind? Is it something related to what Debraj said, every little helps? I know this is a Tesco Rittles, this thing, but basic idea being that, the bottom 40%, maybe partly it's bottom 40% and not 20% because the bottom 20% will face severe non-convexities, whereas the bottom 40% probably they don't.
Yeah. So I don't know how we'll collect, say, 3-4 questions at a time and do it. Kalle, you were...
Yeah, my question is indirect. That I think everybody seems to be just asking for policies, but I think the social organization seems to be equally important. And just take Brazil. I think some of these policies came because they had more social organization. My own home country, Norway, or Scandinavia, Northern Europe, more in general. I think the basic, what made the Scandinavian experience distinct from most other countries in respect to income distribution is social organization. So policies are endogenous to, of course, to a lot of things, including social organization. And I think that is, if you always ask about, just as Debraj said, that you ask for policies that are going to tax the rich, and that is possible if you have a certain social organization, or maybe you can have a social organization that is a substitute for taxation, because the bad consequences of the policies or the biased income distribution is counteracted by the social organization in the country. And I think that these things seems to be lacking in discussion, and it's very much lacking in Piketty's work. He doesn't even mention labor unions in a discussion of inequality in the world over 100 years, but a huge differences across countries and huge differences over time in each country in that type of thing. Just end by one thing to say that just to count the number of billionaires doesn't help very much. I think the country with the highest, one of the highest numbers of billionaires per capita is Sweden. It has, on Forbes' list of billionaires, it's 1.9 billionaires per million inhabitants. Norway has 1.8 billionaires per million inhabitants. The US has 1.5 billionaires per million inhabitants. So I think that says something my main point, that if you have social organization that can counteract the power of very super rich people, it's not so dangerous to have these super rich people. Maybe you shouldn't have them anyway, but they are not so harmful if you have counteracting power.
Okay, let's take one more. Rohini? Yeah, and then.
A comment on Debraj's saving by the poor. I think the poor are clearly desperate to save, so it's not that they don't want to save. Otherwise, we just wouldn't have the West Bengal scam of the proportions we have now, the SKS scam a few years ago. And in terms of just institutions and policy, when I see self-help groups, I actually feel this is an institution. And the only problem so far is it hasn't been focused on a range of savings instruments. It's been focused on other stuff. But there's no reason, since they're operating entirely through commercial banks, which are well regulated, where you have people thinking about what needs to be done. If a range of savings instruments were offered, I bet savings would go up phenomenally without much risk. They are taking huge risks at the moment in trying to save whatever they can.
Okay, how will we do it? Let's respond, whoever wants to respond. I do have something to say to the three questions. Yeah.
Okay. Rohini, I completely agree with you. In fact, the West Bengal scams are a good example of how imperfect knowledge works. Because West Bengal, I think, has the highest prevalence of Ponzi schemes in all of India, right? And of course, people will rush to save when they're offered high rates, very high rates of return. The question is whether they can figure out what's a decent high rate of return from something that's obviously indecent. So that's going to Ajit and Kala's point. Kala, I think this is hugely important, this notion of social organization, and it's because I despair of that in India for at least the next couple of decades. It's not that the Norwegians are like, enlightened altruists, but in any case, in India the problem is tough. And I think when I said it was politically very, very difficult to tax the rich, I was saying exactly what Kaushik was saying about this race to the bottom when it comes to global taxation or even, interregional taxation within India. Land acquisition, for example. So if these coordinations are not carried out at some global or pan-regional level, it's going to be very hard. So my overall view on this, going back to what Ajit was saying, is that I think here's my bottom line. My bottom line is focus on poverty as best as we can. Be absolutely firm at the bottom in terms of providing insurance. Let's do it with conditionality so as to maintain self-selection objectives. For the rest, at least for the next few years, let's rely on the market. This is a statement, this is a pragmatic statement. It's not a statement about my own ethics, which would be compatible with a much higher rate of direct redistribution. But this is what I feel is a good bottom line pragmatic strategy to follow.
Just quickly to respond to Rathin, your point. In fact, I couldn't make it very clear in the end. When we're talking about the redistributive transfers, it's obviously related to we're talking about redistribution, something which is related to the tax management of the government. And the points that you mentioned are obviously relevant. And we do spend too much time on the expenditure part rather than looking at the tax part of it. Although there is at least some concern, even the whole thing about the tax foregone has started coming only 5-6 years back. It was not something which was there in the beginning. But I want to come to a more general point about the whole issue of the rights, in that sense, the way we are going about right to food or anything, or any redistributive tax. It's a kind of a thing which is a kind of a medicine that you do after the symptom is observed. It's not something which, it's a palliative. It's not the cure. It's not something which is a medicine for the origin of the inequality is something, that is where I was going to all the numbers about profit share, wage shares, and the employment patterns and everything. Those are not going to be addressed by simply giving some kind of a benefit this way or that way, whether it is in terms of in-kind or whether it is in terms of cash or anything. And in fact, we had a history of both. In fact, cash transfers, most people assume that this is something which is going to be new. We had a history of cash transfers. At last count, we had more than 60 cash transfers going on in different ways, whether you're talking about the scholarships, the MCMs that we get, or for example, the pensions that we give, or for example, the housing transfers various things that we get. We can go on doing that, but I think these are all not hitting at the structural reasons why inequalities persist, and why certain processes of growth give rise to certain outcomes, which may be increasing inequality or reducing inequalities. And that is where the problem was, that the whole idea of inclusion in that sense is not about giving benefits to the poor after something has happened. Rights have to be important, but in a democratic society, with the perspective of the fact that we are a democratic country, where certain rights have to be given irrespective of what level of inequality you are. But to change the structural nature of inequalities, you will need much more than that. And those efforts are somewhere lacking in the way we are dealing with the issue of inequality.
Let me add a couple of remarks here. Ajit, about the policies that go with this. It's an open question as to what you do. Even for poverty, what looks like an obvious intervention often is not. And I would take some of the ideas that Debraj was talking about in terms of inequality, you bring that to the table. Brazil has had huge success. I mean, we've got now detailed studies of the conditional cash transfers. I mean, economics is complex, you have to keep in mind. Since I was very recently in Brazil, Brazilian growth now is tanking in a way you can't imagine for an emerging economy. Last 2 quarters has been negative growth. There are people in Brazil who are saying that it is a fallout of some of those interventions. I don't think that is correct. I think there are many other things going on. But yes, it's a complicated creature. So on policies, there will be open questions, but the awareness is important. And that actually relates a little bit, the awareness, to social organization, Kalle, that you're talking about. The view that economists also play a role. I mean, if you make people believe that whatever's happening, that is your right desert, and you have to accept it, which has been in India, that's very often been the norm, then you just keep quiet and and economists have contributed to that. Look at the inequality debate, which I find unacceptable, is the huge inequality. Very often in economics, the view is that if you work hard, you'll get, people have made choices. Part of that is true, there'll be some inequality. But I have been trying with my colleagues at the World Bank to compute inequality at birth. It will need a lot of assumptions. But I believe that about 80% of the inequality you see in life is at birth. You're being born with absolutely nothing, and people are being born with huge opportunities. That can't be hard work, because no one has worked hard at 2 months or 3 months. It's entirely happening because of what you're inheriting. So that awareness in society is important, and from that awareness will come a demand, because beyond the point, us talking of these policies is not good enough, because the vested interest at the top is so high that unless there is a demand which becomes loud, there is not going to be a response. With the demand, there is one danger. Also, a lot of it becomes so knee-jerk that you go for policies which do greater damage. I mean, modern economics does tell you about markets and all, which you have to be aware of when you go for some of these interventions. I just get a little bit of hope, because I feel within economics, the extreme right and the extreme left are falling out, and there is a bit of a convergence of opinion, people who understand the role of markets and feel that it's a great injustice the way the world stands today. And Rohini, very briefly, the poor are, I feel desperate to say, but the misinformation part is also very large. So when you make something attractive, it depends on attractive how. It can be because you're cheating them, it looks very attractive, they fall for that. But the hard evidence that the poor save given the opportunity actually comes back from 1969. India's savings rate was very low till the late 1960s. It just shoots up over the next 7-8 years. From about 12%, it goes to 22%. And something big happened in 1969. Banks were nationalized, and a directive was given to these banks to open up branches in remote areas. And if you actually count the number of branches, and I did that once upon a time, you see the bank branches just shooting up over this period, and the savings rate shoots up. So this just is one form of evidence that given the opportunity, people would go and save. And Rathin, did you want to add?
No, just to your point, actually. I think one other problem is that people are quite aware that, what's been happening with savings, have you noticed that we have something called physical savings, which is calculated residual, but it's basically money that doesn't see a bank. That ratio of physical savings to financial savings is actually rising over time, which in fact means the poor are not saving, because the poor don't, contrary to popular opinion, indulge in much physical saving that is counted. So these self-help groups coming into the banking system is a good thing, but I don't know how much inequality will reduce if the government continues to borrow large amounts of money for consumption, essentially from rich people. I suppose one good thing, there is some relatively poor people who are saving, will get that reduced inequality there, possibly. Yeah. Your point, I think what has been happening in India's political economy is the government is responding all the time in the context of inequality to social organizations. And that is how it thinks. They may not be the social organizations you and I like, but those organizations are very, very important in terms of the way the government thinks about inequality reduction. So that is happening, I think, in ample measure. The question is that, when you try and formalize that and make it sustainable, why is it not working? And that's not a problem economists can answer, I agree.
I was just talking about time management. I was thinking of taking 3 more questions maybe from that room. And the PPP, I'll talk in a small group later on as we are leaving. It is a rather mechanical kind of problem. Well, that's we are seeing ourselves. Are there? Just ask. Yes. Are there any questions from the other rooms? Rooms, plural. Okay. And they will begin to ask, or there'll be a show of hands?
There's no share.
Okay.
No question from room 13.
No questions from room number 13. Room number 14, any questions?
No questions. Yeah.
Okay, very good. One person here seems to know that. Where did the answer come from? I don't know. Let's take the questions here then. Okay, yeah. Can you give the mic to her?
Sir, this is my question to you, Kaushik Basu, sir. Sir, you mentioned how global consensus of policies is required to tackle poverty issues. But sir, can you please elaborate as to how this is possible, A, and B, how sir mentioned that each policy is very country specific. You can't be implementing the same policy to all countries. So can you please elaborate as to how this is viable or possible?
Give you a short answer. Yeah. Okay, let's take one at the back over there. Yeah.
My question is to Dr. Himanshu. That one thing that we are always talking about the reduction in the poverty, or the in response to the poverty line that has been set up by the World Bank, $1.25 per day. But what about the vulnerable people, for example, whose income lies between, say, $1.50 per day to $1.25 per day? What's happening to them? Because if their proportion is increasing, then that's not a very good sign. Along with the reduction in, although for the people who are actually even below that poverty line, something like that. So,
okay,
that's my question.
Let's take one here. There's Anand here. Well, you can speak in front.
Thank you. About the causative factors leading to greater inequality in India, I think there was just a hint in what Dr. Himanshu mentioned, but otherwise probably it was not mentioned. One area perhaps which perhaps would be relevant is the role of asset price inflation. We have had persistent inflation over the years, and asset price inflation, particularly land and its transfers, is one of the very critical factors which perhaps needs to be looked at. I mean, that's just a comment, and maybe if you could comment on that. The other is, of course, the point that India's tax GDP ratio is low. That is a fact, of course. But what also is perhaps not adequately appreciated is the expenditure to GDP ratio is also very low. A fact which probably was brought out in one of the chapters on the global economy that was brought out under Professor Basu.
Yeah. Debraj, do you want to come in, or shall we take in a few more? Did you want to come in right now? Or let's take 2 more.
Yeah.
The time was supposed to be till 6 or 6:30. 6:30. Then we can take a few more. Yeah, go ahead, at the back. 6. It was 6.
2 more.
This is primarily for Debraj sir and Kaushik sir. So when we generally measure inequalities in consumption, so the measures of consumption that are normally considered, they don't look at goods that may potentially be invisible, such as investment in education. I mean, this links back to the point of knowledge as a commodity, as you were mentioning earlier. So the investment by education is often variable in the sense that sometimes you have subsidized education where the government is spending. You have cases where the individual himself or herself is spending on his or her own education, or those of his or her children. In the light of all this, this is often not considered. And I feel that in an intertemporal sense of how inequality is changing, we should be considering investment in education, because that is something that has the greatest potential to change the course of this flow. So I would like your comments on that.
Okay, and let's take one more and we'll do some answers. Why don't you? Did you have a, yeah.
Yes, I'm Yashodhan Ghorpade. Yashodhan Ghorpade. I think if I can just add to the last question, many of the problems of service delivery with health, education, are things we can't change by just throwing money at it or just with a fiscal sort of instrument. And I wonder if we're overstating the importance of redistribution, not in itself, but in terms of its ability to sort of paper over some of these more unyielding problems.
Okay, so let's again, yeah.
Is that okay?
Response?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So we're just going through our last round here,
Yeah,
right?
last round.
Okay. So I just want to respond to some of these points about this sort of deep structural issues that are driving inequality. It's related to several comments made over there, the comment that you just made, Himanshu's question about what is causing the inequality in India as well as elsewhere, and Kaushik's point about inequality at birth. So I want to tell you, just as a summary, what I think is, obviously, it's a caricature, but just to bring one feature to the forefront, what I consider to be the fundamental driver of long-term inequality, which is what I call the fourth fundamental law of capitalism, right? The fourth fundamental law of capitalism is that capital invariably tends to displace labor, okay? And over the next several decades, this is my prediction, I won't be alive to see it, but over the next several decades, I feel we'll be moving to a situation where most routine tasks can be performed automatically or in automated fashion. And the only role for human beings in the very long run is to be a generator of ideas. Okay, so it's good, and even routine R&D is going to be carried out in an automated fashion. Okay, so we are talking about very core R&D type ideas or education, right? Now, 8 billion people on the planet are not all going to be engaged in R&D, right? So it is a really important question as to how human beings are going to be compensated in a market system for the endowments that they have, which is essentially labor or financial capital, right? So leaving out financial capital, I think there is very little hope, right, in terms of combating worldwide inequality that's going to happen over the next several decades. So I think if you look at it from this perspective, from the fourth fundamental law perspective, then I think that holding financial capital at the level of every household, thinking about how to invest financial capital, hold the firms, right? Because you're not going to be able to create the firms. We have to hold the firms, right? Bequeathing that to the next generation. So going back to this question of inequality at birth, I think is among the most, among the deepest questions that we have to engage in if we want to think constructively about long-term rising inequality. So.
Yeah, I mean, fully agree with what Debraj was saying. Not much to add except to answer your question, Mr. I mean, this is not a question of which poverty line do you use. I mean, like, this is something which is now at least undisputed fact. I mean, after what has happened after 2004-05, things have improved. At least people who are at the bottom end of the distribution. So even if you take the double of the poverty line or anything, or take any other measure of the position of durables or anything, you do find that prosperity has increased. But rising prosperity at the bottom end of the distribution is not inconsistent with rising inequality. So that is what I was trying to drive home. And I think the issue that is going to where the structural issues become, and that is what he was hinting at, is the issue of employment. In the sense, the kind of employment labor market, what you were talking about, social organizations or the way employment markets are going to behave. Because what is going to happen with increasing financialization and increasing automation and capitalization is also the way the labor operates with, engages with. I mean, unless machines produce machines, human beings are going to be there, but the role of the human beings in the entire production chain is something that will be deciding what outcomes you will get. And the equality of opportunity in that sense is going to be the key driver of those issues. Your birth, caste, your religion, your location, whether you're in a remote area or in this country or that country, your birth is something which is going to drive a lot of things, but also the ability to overcome these will depend on the kind of state role that is going to be there in managing or regulating these processes.
I'll keep it short, so I'm going to pull in the questions. Actually, the last point that Debraj was making, I fully agree with this. I feel the big challenge, and that relates to the question you're asking, what are the possible ideas to take on this challenge, there are some real difficult ones. And the main one comes from the fact that I feel the total wage bill in the world, there's already evidence that over the last 25 years, it's just dropping as a share of global GDP. That's going to go smaller and smaller. And if we rely on just inherited rights to income, there's going to be a big chunk of the population that is going to go poorer and poorer. Actually, the first tensions will develop in rich countries, I believe, because the poorer workers who are now getting integrated into the global market are in poor countries. So they will begin to get some of the jobs. So the first big pressure will be the bottom end of the rich countries. Then it will come back over here. So we do need some fairly dramatic changes, some forms of transfers at the time of birth, other rights which come through holding little bits of shares from which you earn your income. It can't just be from labor, then a big chunk of the world is going to collapse. Whether that will happen, I don't know. The world may just actually go up in a complete turmoil because we don't manage to take on this problem. Rathin was asking me to talk to his first question that he raised about what is it that leads an organization like the World Bank to move from one goal to another. This particular one, I can tell you, it's nothing but just ideas coming to the table. I mean, I was involved in the bringing the shared prosperity to the table, exactly how you write it up. Usually it's a chaotic debate. All kinds of ideas come to the table, and then you drive something through. I don't think there's anything more. Having said that, at the top level of government, international organizations, there is a lot of effort that goes into the shaping of opinion. Subtle ways and all, because you know that in the end, and this talks to your organization, the base level demand, societal structures can change if opinion begins to go one way or the other. In the olden days, I remember in the US, you would talk about the freedom of all factor mobility being very important across borders, but labor you would never talk about. And the strategy was to keep it out of discourse, because once it came into discourse, it is so obvious the way you have to tackle that. The only way is to keep it out of discourse. That does happen in big organizations, big governments, the opinion control. But in this case, I don't think there was anything to it because I was involved. It sounded wrong. I'm sorry.
I was hoping you would say that the US government had a change of heart. But because that's normally where that's the biggest social organization that influences the bank management. But it's changing. Yeah, that's what I was, yeah. Okay, I just want to respond to one simple question. It's good news because what I'm hearing you guys say from my sort of very limited perch is that transfers ain't going to do the trick anymore. They need to be there, but we cannot rely on the caloric equalization principle as operated by the state to bring about a desired sort of equity position, because there are much deeper structural factors at work and we'll have to confront them. Now there, your question is very pertinent. Let me give it to you in a very stylized way in a minute. Take education. Public education spending in this country as a percentage of GDP is less than Nepal. We know that. Jean Drèze knows that, Himanshu knows that. We also know that what we spend very badly. Jean Drèze knows that, I know that, Himanshu knows that. We also know that why we spend money badly, how it is spent badly, apart from moments in our public policy discourse, is largely opaque. Jean Drèze knows that, Himanshu knows that, I know that. Now, what do Jean Drèze and Himanshu do? And they're honorable men and women, right? So I'm not talking about some carpetbagger, I'm talking about the guy here. Because he knows that, he knows he can't say much that is concrete about how to improve public expenditure. Therefore, they argue to maintain what are essentially highly unproductive levels of public spending in education. And it's very difficult to deal with the emotive argument, the Ministry of Finance. How do I tell people you're taking away money from the mouths of children? But I know the problem lies there. So that institutional system needs to be fixed. And fixing that, I agree with you, the solution is not to say, let's provide less public education now, a la Narega, and then provide more later. But I think that until we're able to open up this policy dialogue, which the Expenditure Management Commission hopefully will allow us to do, there is very little hope that we will not continue down this awful path of spending less than we ought to, and what we spending badly. That's the problem. And that problem is not an economics problem. It's a political economy, institutional problem.
Thank you very much.
A small souvenir from us to the panelists. And a big hand, please.
May I propose a vote of thanks for this conference organization by Trideep? Just fantastic. And
give a formal vote of thanks, Debraj.
You can't thank yourself. Somebody
Yeah, well, just to, so it's time. So, we're just concluding this wonderful conference. Let me spend, 1 minute, 2 minutes to thank so first my wonderful colleagues, the other members